Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man tabi'a al-huda. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, brothers and sisters in Islam, friends, colleagues, students, followers. This morning we're going to present part 2 of the rebuttal that Mr. Denis Giron wrote, and which you can find on the website infidels.org. And as we mentioned in part 1, his article claims that there are scientific absurdities in the Quran, and we rebutted and refuted and basically destroyed all of his false claims that he mentioned, and we clarified his lack of understanding, number 1, of the Arabic language. Number 2, his lack of how to do precise scientific research. And today we're going to continue on rebutting his false claims. So Denis Giron, he says, now talking about the thought of trees, he says, if the thought of trees and stones talking was not enough, then the Quran mentions clouds that can speak. Allah says in the Quran in verse 41:11 that the clouds will respond and say, we come willingly or unwillingly. And they said, we come willingly. Most readers pass right by this verse, but many questions come up when analyzing it. At what point does water vapor become conscious? Is a water molecule alive? With 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 of oxygen, where is the brain or the orifice required of speech, or required for speech? Stories of living matter, rocks, etc., acting similar to living organisms is also found in the Quran. There are stories of mountains that have fear. In the Quran, verse number 33:72, fear is an emotion which is caused by chemical impulses in the brain. Do the mountains made of stone and dirt have brains with these chemical impulses taking place? First of all, Dennis, I will respond to you and I will say that many physicists have differed with you in conflict with your claims and mentioned things contrary to what you claim here, solely because it has been established scientifically that trees actually have a language, that trees actually have feelings and emotions, and they are affected by communication and speech. They also feel those who are around them. A plant physiologist at the University of Western Australia in Crawley by the name of Monica Gagliano, she mentioned this in one of her research papers. Also, another physicist by the name of Ed Wagner out of Oregon, he also mentioned that he has found evidence that trees talk to each other in a language he calls W waves. So are these findings from these scientists also considered to be from the scientific absurdities as well? You might have overlooked this information, Dennis, or your research skills may have been deficient, and this is what led you to being hasty in criticizing the Quran and the Sunnah. So as long as physicists and other scientists have established that trees have language or feelings or emotions, then it is not impossible. And you only denounced it and denied this, that this is present and existent because of your lack of knowledge of it. And this is from the greatest mistakes you made here and that you repeated numerous times throughout your article. So I ask you a question now, Dennis. What makes you so sure and so certain that these trees or other inanimate objects don't have the ability to speak? Perhaps this was discovered after you wrote your article. And don't forget, Dennis, that the nature of scientific knowledge and knowledge in general is that researchers and scientists will discover new things constantly, and they will be continuously updating their discoveries and findings. They will discover things now that we didn't know 10 or 20 years ago. So, indeed, the intellectual and rational thinker should never be hasty in criticizing something that he has not completely researched or understood. Also, it is known, Dennis, in the Arabic language and amongst those who study the Arabic language that there is something called al-haqiqi and al-majaz. Meaning, al-haqiqi meaning the literal interpretation or the literal understanding, and majaz, which can be translated as the abstract meaning. And al-haqiqi, technically it means it is the literal meaning of the word without transferring it or interpreting it to mean something else. As for majaz, then it is transferring or interpreting the literal meaning to mean something else, either in the language or in the technical usage. So the word that you're referring to in the verse, firstly, we established that it is haqiqi, that it is real and it is literal. And we believe that the clouds, that the sky, that the earth speak with the special way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has granted them, either verbally, either physically, or the special ways that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them to communicate. We as Muslims first establish that they speak solely because we are certain about the truthfulness of the Quran, and that everything mentioned in the Quran is true and authentic. And it is not a condition for us to establish the authenticity and correctness of this information that we understand it completely with all of its intricate details. And if we suppose, Dennis, for your sake, if we supposed that the intention in the verse was majaz, was abstract, then we would say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used this word to express the dire need of the creation to submit to Him, and that nothing from amongst His creation should disobey Him. So what makes you know, Dennis, that the mountains don't have feelings or emotions? What makes you know that the person sitting next to you likes you or dislikes you? He could dislike you or like you or feel uncomfortable next to you. How do you know the feelings of other human beings who are from your own species? Either by that person telling you how he felt or by your experience. Other than these two ways, then one is not able to tell how someone, even from his own species, feels about him. If you didn't see that person making any facial expressions or gestures to express how he felt, or he didn't tell you how he felt, does this mean that he doesn't have any feelings, or that his feelings don't exist because you didn't understand them? You are a human being, Dennis, just like me, who isn't even capable of knowing the feelings of other human beings around you. So how can you denounce or deny that other species and other creatures and things in the creation don't have feelings? Now this is against rational and intellectual thinking, Dennis. So now we don't understand how the mountains feel and have emotions, and we're not able to establish it now scientifically. And the only way we can establish it is through revelation from the Creator, who is more knowledgeable than us and knows the wisdom behind these things and knows the intricate details. Our human intellects are deficient and weak. The things that we don't know are more than the things that we do know. Similarly, Dennis, the different languages that exist all throughout the world, just as we don't understand all of the languages in the world that people use to communicate, and they are from the human species. So how can we deny the existence of them just because we don't understand them? Indeed, this is extremely irrational and extremely illogical, Mr. Dennis. Then Denis Giron, he goes on to say, he says, one major scientific error in the Quran can be seen in the following verse. In talking about the story of Dhul Qarnayn in Surah Al-Kahf, chapter 18, verses 85 and 86, when he talks about the sun setting in a muddy spring or the sun setting in a well. And he says modern science has taught us that the earth revolves around the sun. The above excerpt from the Quran seems to state that it is the sun that moves as well as sets on earth. If the sun were to touch the surface of the earth, everything would be incinerated and all life would die. I say, Dennis, where is the scientific error here? First of all, would any intellectual actually think that the sun sets inside a well or a hot spring? Rather, the mistake is from your misunderstanding of the Arabic language, my friend. The word fi in Arabic has numerous meanings. The meaning that it normally takes is inside. Inside. For example, I say, Al-kitabu fi sunduq. The book is in the box, for example. But also, it can have other meanings as well. Just like many other prepositions in the Arabic language, such as ala, or fawqa, or ma'a, or ila, or min, or inda, nahwa, an. So it is the context that these prepositions are used which determines its meaning. So the meaning of fi here, the meaning of fi, which literally means in, here it means something else. Here it means fawqa, means above, as it is clear in the context of the verse for the one who understands Arabic. Also, your objection to the wording in the verse, the sun setting above the well, then I say that even in the English language, our usage is sunrise and sunset. But Dennis, does the sun rise and ascend above as the verse proves, as it is translated in the English language? Of course not. Even scientifically, the sun does not ascend or rise, nor does it descend. Rather, it revolves and swims or is floating in space. And we also know scientifically that the sun does not stay in one place, just as the English wording proves that as well. The movement of the sun moves in a circular motion in itself as well as within the universe, just as the earth does and revolves around the sun according to science. And it looks as though it is setting and rising in our eyes and from our perspective. So these doubts and misconceptions that you are suggesting, Dennis, are based upon, first of all, your lack of knowledge of the Arabic language, and secondly, your lack of knowledge of the Quran. So we ask the Creator of the heavens and the earth to guide you, to know Him, and worship Him, and understand His speech correctly. Then, Dennis, he goes on to talk about mythical beings known in Islam as jinn. There are Muslims who believe that jinn stand on top of each other's shoulders all the way up to heaven and listen to what is being discussed. There is a hadith in Sahih Bukhari narrated by Aisha, number 650, that says soothsayers and psychics receive some of their information until the end of his claim here. So I say, Dennis, where did you conclude that the jinn stand above each other in the heavens? Please provide a hadith or a Quranic verse that proves your claim. Secondly, where and how have you concluded this? And please mention to me the height of the jinn. Also mention for me the distance between the heavens and the earth. So I go on saying, Dennis, that your statement here proves your lack of understanding and deficiencies in reading and researching. Even scientists and astronomers have established that stars move. And if you were to read and study these articles about the stars moving, would you admit and confirm that it is possible? Well, it is possible that the stars are used to shoot the jinn. And if you don't admit this possibility, then this is another clear proof that you're only following your desires and you won't accept the truth from scientists and scholars who are more knowledgeable than you, especially in knowledge related to the stars and outer space. So your claim and statement here, Dennis, is completely incorrect, and until now you have not come with any decisive proofs or evidence for any of your claims throughout your article, saying that the Quran and the Sunnah contain scientific absurdities. Actually, Dennis, the Quran established this fact about shooting stars before over 1430 years ago. And the astronomers and astrologers have only discovered it within the past 100 of years, 200 years, 300 years. So is this against the norm, Dennis? Or no? Or is it another coincidence? Then he goes on to say, then Denis Giron goes on to say, talking about, in the Quran it mentions a story in chapter 27, verses 18 and 19. He's actually talking about the story of Sulaiman alayhi salam, when the ants communicated with Sulaiman, and the ants communicated with each other. So he says, while zoologists have formed methods of communicating with apes and chimps, no human being has ever been able to understand the language of species different from our own. The ability to speak like a human is formed by advanced brains with complex thought patterns, something most animals do not have. Therefore, to think that a man could understand the spoken language of another animal is absurd. And then he goes on saying, this blunder is understandable, as the average desert Arab in the 7th century would not know this. However, this lack of knowledge of the animal kingdom proves human origin of the text and disputes theories of a divine origin. So I say, Dennis, listen, what you mentioned is correct. This is because our Creator, Allah the Most High, He taught the Prophet Sulaiman, the Prophet Solomon, the language of birds. And Allah is capable of all things. And also here, Dennis, you're contradicting yourself. First, you mentioned that the scholars established means and ways to communicate with chimpanzees and with other species, meaning that you admit yourself and confirm yourself that there is a possibility that two different types of species can communicate with each other, humans and animals. And you also mentioned that it is not possible for humans to understand the language of a different species. May Allah guide you, Mr. Dennis. Doesn't the word, now we're going to learn some more Arabic now. Doesn't the word muhawara meaning a communication or an exchange of conversation or communication between two people or more. So doesn't this indicate in the Arabic language that there is participation and interaction between two people or two things? No matter if the language between them is verbal, if it's written, if they are movements or gestures or sign language or the likes. So I ask you, Dennis, do you believe in sign language? Also, do all human beings understand sign language? And if they don't understand it, does this mean that it doesn't exist? If you came across two mute people, two people who don't speak, who communicate they communicate but without words or sounds, and they communicate with sign language, and they understand each other. So if another person came along and he didn't understand what they were saying, and he said that they are not speaking and communicating with each other, or it's not possible that they communicate, what would you say about this person? We would say that this person is mistaken, solely because they are communicating with their own language. And our lack of understanding of their language does not mean that it doesn't exist. If you asked the dog, do you want to eat? And then the dog began to bark and shake its tail and jump up and down, then the intellectual and rational thinker would understand that the dog is hungry and that the dog wants to eat, without the dog speaking the same language of the person, of the human being. So who is more developed and advanced, Dennis? And whose brain is stronger? A chimpanzee, a dog, or a human being? If it is easy for chimpanzees and dogs to understand language of humans, and their brains are less developed, then logically and intellectually and rationally speaking, if the human's brain is more powerful, then it is easier for the human to understand the language of dogs and chimpanzees and even insects or ants. No matter if it is speech or sounds or movements or gestures, as language and communication skills, Dennis, have different types and different manifestations, just as we have something called body language. This is the greatest proof that it is possible for us as human beings to understand other languages. and that it is not impossible for us to understand the language of animals. So this falsifies your claim once again, Dennis, that it is impossible for humans to understand the language of another species. Also, your claim contradicts not only the Quran and Sunnah, but also the sound intellect and rational and logical reasoning. And I think these actually are from the intellectual absurdities that are in your conscience, Dennis. So, Dennis, once again, you've brought more weak claims which are based upon your lack of understanding and, sorry to say, your ignorance. And I've already cleared to you that Allah is the one who taught the Prophet Sulaiman the language of the birds. And similarly, it is not impossible intellectually, logically, and rationally to accept this. Ants have numerous ways of communicating, sometimes by scent, sometimes by smell, sometimes by sounds they make by rubbing their legs together. You only mentioned one way of communication that ants use, and this is another proof of your deficient research skills. Let me ask you a question, Dennis. If you left your house, do you know what is the exact temperature outside without looking at a thermometer or device? And would you admit that the heat of the sun exists? So once again, don't deny the existence of something based upon your lack of knowledge of it. There exists numerous scientific studies that prove that ants communicate with sound. So my advice to you, Dennis, is just stop wasting your time trying to find deficiencies in the Quran and Sunnah and focus more on fixing the deficiencies within yourself and within your logic and within your ways that you claim that you are thinking rationally. Francesca Barbero from the University of Turin is reported to have said, "Our new work shows that the role of sound in information exchange within ant colonies has been greatly underestimated." Professor Jeremy Thomas of the University of Oxford, he said, "The most important discovery is that within the ant colony, different sounds can provoke different reactions." So now I say to you, Dennis, the Arab, the Bedouin, the desert dweller, and specifically the Muslims knew about these things over 1400 years ago from the Quran, Dennis. And you, the so-called civilized, enlightened, advanced gentleman who possesses all the means, all the technological advices and resources, weren't able to know this only up until the past century. So there exist many other types of knowledge, Dennis, many other types of discoveries and sciences that the Muslims learned from the Quran and Sunnah before you and your counterparts ever even thought about by hundreds of years. For example, like the stages of development of the embryo in the womb, the barzakh, the barrier between fresh water and salt water, the mountains, that the mountains above the earth, the size of them below the earth is double. And your scholars, Dennis, only came to knowledge of these things within the past century. So who now is more advanced, more civilized, more enlightened in regards to knowledge and understanding? The civilized, developed, advanced man with all his technological devices, depending upon his five senses, or the Arabic Bedouin who lived in the desert 1400 years ago, Dennis? Rather, Dennis, what you mentioned here just shows us the confusion within your understanding. For indeed, the Muslim Arabs and the Muslims knew these things and much more before 1438 years ago, as we mentioned. And the verse in the Quran, if it is understood literally, mentions that the ant communicated with the other ants verbally. And this is correct, and we are certain of this. Even you yourself admitted and conferred and confirmed that the ants communicate with each other. So it isn't a condition to understand how they communicate. Do you smell the scent, the fragrance that the ants use to communicate? You established and you said that the ants communicate by fragrances or by leaving scents, or they communicate by smell. Do you smell that scent, Dennis? So this verse in the Quran, it mentions that the ant communicated with the rest of the ants. And we are already in agreement that ants communicate with each other. But I say they communicate sometimes by smell, sometimes by sounds, and maybe other ways of communication that we haven't discovered yet. As a scientist by the name of Mr. Lewis Smith, he established and he mentioned in the magazine called Environment Reporter, when he said, advances in audio technology have enabled scientists to discover that ants routinely talk to each other in their nests. So Dennis, we as Muslims are certain and sure that the Prophet Sulaiman heard the sound of an ant, a real sound. But however, if we were to suppose that the Prophet Solomon didn't hear any sound of the ant, then your claim is falsified once again, Mr. Dennis. And I ask you, what is it that prohibits him from not communicating with the ant? Perhaps the ant communicated with sign language, or body movements, or gestures. And we know in the Arabic language that is so vast and so immense and so deep that sometimes the word qawl, which means a statement, or verbal statement normally, sometimes it can mean a gesture. Sometimes it can mean a nonverbal statement. Sometimes it can mean a movement. Sometimes it can mean even an inclination or thought. So it is also not hard to believe, Dennis, that Prophet Solomon did understand what the ant communicated to him, if it was done using one of these means of communication, just as it is not impossible or hard to believe that a human understands the speech, sounds, or movements of a dog. Allah, our Creator, is able to do all things. So after pondering and contemplating over this, then it becomes clear that there is no scientific absurdity or mistake at all. So then Dennis, he goes on to say, he says, the Quran states that Allah created the sky in layers and decked the lowest heaven with lamps in the Quran, chapter 67, verses 3 through 5, and adorned it with the beauty of the stars. And he mentions in chapter 37, verse 6, and then he mentions another verse in chapter 71, verses 15 and 16, talking about how the moon is within the seven heavens and the beauty of the stars. So he says, if the stars and lamps are in the lowest heaven, they are either closer to the earth than the moon or at an equal distance from the earth as the moon. Either way, this is scientifically inaccurate. So I say, Dennis, listen, Dennis. This is what NASA has proved. NASA has only proved and established this fact within the past 100 years. And Allah established it over 1430 years ago. So who was the first to establish it, Dennis? The Quran, the Sunnah, and the Bedouin Arabs, as you say? Or the civilized, developed, advanced, technological gentlemen and researchers such as yourself? And if Allah, our Creator, established this in the Quran over 1430 years ago, then this is only proof that our Creator, that Allah, the most magnificent, is all knowledgeable and knows everything, knows more than NASA, knows more than you, and more than everyone and everything in the creation. And this also proves that this is a miracle from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So now, looking at the other things that you mentioned in your claim, I will say yes, Dennis, the two verses in Surah Mulk mention that the stars are within the sky of this world. However, you made a mistake in your claim about the other surah you mentioned, Surah Nuh. because this surah did not mention exactly where the moon is, nor did it mention that it is closer or farther from the stars. Allah mentioned in the verse, using the Arabic word, fihinna, fihinna, which literally can be translated to mean in them, in the sky, in the sky. But here, Dennis, as we talked about previously, that the prepositions in Arabic language can have different meanings according to their context. So the correct meaning here for fihinna is ma'ahunna, which means with them, meaning that the moon is with the stars, and the stars are with the moon in the sky. And this is from the eloquence of the Quran and the different types of usage of the words within the Arabic language. And this is what the scholars of Arabic language and balagha call al-majaz al-mursal. For example, it is like one saying, I lived in New York, and you only lived in one borough or one neighborhood of it, which is not comparable to all of New York, the whole state of New York in itself. So other scholars of Islam have said that this verse means that the surface of the earth is filled with light during the darkness of the night, and it is within one of the skies of this world. And this is what the scholars call, the Arabic scholars and those who studied Islam and those who know Arabic grammar and syntax, these are what the scholars call tanawub ma'ani huruf al-jar. Tanawub ma'ani huruf al-jar. The substitution of the meanings of prepositions. For example, we said the word fi, which literally means in, can sometimes mean with, ma'an. So what is correct is that the moon and the stars are within the seven heavens, Dennis. So then he goes on to say, Denis Giron goes on to mention the hadith in which monkeys are Muslims. Monkeys are Muslims. And he mentions, he says in Sahih Bukhari, number 188, narrated by Amr ibn Maymun, that during the pre-Islamic period of ignorance, I saw a she-monkey surrounded by a number of monkeys. They were all stoning it because it had committed illegal sexual intercourse. I too stoned it along with them. So now he says, it is a rule with both Islam and Judaism that women who commit adultery are to be stoned. According to the above hadith, monkeys were subject to this law as well. What other laws do monkeys follow? Are they required to make a pilgrimage to Mecca? Are they required to read the Quran? What constitutes adultery in the monkey world? This is a simple myth. And then he brings a Hindu myth. So I respond to him, Dennis, where in the text does it mention that the monkeys are Muslims, first of all? And if we were to suppose that your statement was correct, that the monkeys are actually subject to these laws, then we would say that the monkeys and their laws and their social practices are far better than what many of the nations throughout the world practice. And that monkeys actually have ardor and a type of protective jealousy about their spouses and loved ones and female relatives. The opposite of what we find many of those who live in the so-called civilized and developed countries. We find in these so-called developed and civilized countries that many people's parents encourage promiscuity, encourage their youth to go out and fornicate. They encourage immorality and sexual relations out of wedlock, advising their children to have boyfriends and girlfriends and commit fornication before marriage, telling them, don't be in such a rush to get married. Try a few. And nor do they care or are concerned about the harms of fornication and the diseases spread by the results of fornication. There exist no laws at all about fornication in these so-called civilized and developed countries. Rather, the society encourages it and promotes it and facilitates it for the young men and women, as well as married people as well. So who is worse, Dennis? And I'm asking all intellectual thinkers as well, who is worse? Monkeys that have a sense of ardor and protective jealousy over their females, who will kill or fight or combat those who transgress or try to harm or fornicate with their spouses, daughters, and loved ones? or the so-called civilized, developed, advanced intellectuals who allow every Tom, Dick, and Harry to fornicate with their wives, their daughters, and mothers without any type of feelings or concern. So if we were to suppose that the monkeys were following and do follow this law, then could what they follow be considered far better than what many human beings follow, who many of them don't protect and preserve the honor and dignity, respect of their female relatives? And first of all, Dennis, the narration you mentioned is not a hadith. It's not a hadith. Rather, this is what the scholars call an athar. And an athar are narrations that are from the disciples and companions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or those who preceded the Prophet, those who came after the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And similarly, this athar is not upon the conditions that Imam al-Bukhari set when he compiled his book as-Sahih. And this narration is transmitted by Amr ibn Maymun, who is from the major tabi'een. And he is not a companion. He is not a disciple of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And he actually lived during the pre-Islamic times and accepted Islam during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, but he didn't actually get to meet him, nor did he narrate from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And these people, individuals such as this, are called mukhadrameen. Mukhadrameen. Those who accepted Islam in the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ but didn't meet the Prophet. Also, Imam Bukhari, the compiler of the book from which you mentioned this narration, when he mentioned this athar, that it is not upon his conditions that he set for the rest of the fundamental narrations that he placed in his book. Imam Bukhari only wanted to hint and point to a benefit in it to emphasize the point that Amr ibn Maymun witnessed the pre-Islamic period of Jahiliyyah, and that Imam Bukhari was not concerned with what Amr ibn Maymun had mentioned of the occurrence which happened in the pre-Islamic times, that about the monkeys fornicating and stoning them for fornication. So the other, Dennis, is actually weak and not accepted, nor does it meet up to the conditions of acceptance, solely because one of the narrators, Nu'aym ibn Hammad, he is from those whom Imam Bukhari mentioned in his book, Sahih. He only mentioned his narrations to be suspended narrations and not with connected chains of narration. And similarly, Dennis, Imam al-Bukhari narrated it with another narrator and didn't join him with anyone else except in this narration that has a disconnected chain that is also not upon his conditions. So if we were to suppose, Dennis, that the narration is authentic, then we would say that the narrator was only relaying what he saw from the pre-Islamic times. And there is no problem at all in doing so. And mentioning what he thought occurred by observing a group of monkeys stoning another monkey. So this is what the narrator thought was occurring, that they were stoning the other monkey for fornicating. He didn't take this story or understanding or opinion or narrative from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But if the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam did say this and relay this narrative, and this is not the case here, then we would have believed him without any hesitation. Perhaps Amr ibn Maymun knew that the monkey fornicated from experience or from proofs that we don't know about or that he didn't mention, as monkeys are from some of the animals that fornicate the most of all other animals. And the Arabs actually even strike parables and analogies when they say that this person, for example, ezna min qirdatin, right? That this person, he fornicates more than a monkey. And if fornication amongst them was not known to be popular within their species, then Amr ibn Maymun would not have mentioned this or stroked this analogy or parable. And there is no creature that resembles these animals, the monkeys, more than the human being in their spousal relations. And animals sometimes transgress against each other and fight against each other and jump upon each other and punish each other as well. Some use biting as a punishment. Some scratch as a form of punishment. Some break and smash as a form of punishment. Monkeys, specifically, they hit with their hands and throw rocks as forms of punishment sometimes, just as we see that many humans do as well. So if these monkeys, Dennis, if these monkeys were stoning each other for something other than fornication, and the narrator, Amr ibn Maymun, thought that it was because of fornication, then this is not a problem. And if he had another proof that he used to derive that view, and that the stoning was because of fornication, this is also not far-fetched, solely because, as we mentioned previously, that monkeys are some of the most jealous and arduous animals toward their spouses, and the closest to human beings in their behavior. So if this occurrence was proved to be true, Dennis, then it proves that monkeys are far better than pigs, and that monkeys are far better than many people who live in the world today. Far better, especially than those who promote wife sharing and husband sharing, and those known as swingers, and allow their female relatives to fornicate with every man, a new man every week, or every month, or every other day. So many of the false claims and allegations that you have mentioned have all been refuted, have all been falsified, have all been eliminated, and yet, Dennis, you have not mentioned any clear, authentic proofs for any of your claims that the Quran and the Sunnah contain scientific absurdities. And actually, we are coming to find more and more throughout your article that the absurdities and the things which are very illogical and irrational are the principles that you are using from your deficient intellect to try to prove some of your claims that you mentioned here in this article. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us guidance and grant us sadad and grant us firmness upon the Quran and Sunnah, and defending the Quran and Sunnah from all types of ignorance and all types of evil and negative things directed toward it. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserve all of us and preserve all of you and guide all of those who have false claims about the Quran and the Sunnah. Thank you for joining us this evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.